Okay, if I could have everybody's attention. I'd like to get our luncheon talk underway here. And our luncheon speaker, closing out what I hope has been an informative morning for all of us, really needs no introduction. Certainly not to any of you, but I'll give you one anyway. William Bratton was appointed chief of the Los Angeles Police Department in October of 2002. This past October, he became, I believe, the first chief to be reappointed to a second 5-year term in office in the city's history. Now, Chief Bratton oversees the third largest police department in the United States, managing 9,600 sworn officers, 3,000 civilian employees, and an annual budget that's, I believe, a little over $1 billion. His record as chief has been one of constant innovation, improving both crime fighting and accountability. After Chief Bratton's 4 years in office, crime in Los Angeles, including on Skid Row, has plummeted, in fact, to historically low levels, with serious crimes down citywide over 30% and homicides down 40%. And he's done this while expanding the LAPD's counterterrorism efforts in innovative ways that other departments across the country are learning from and emulating. Now, none of what has happened in LA would surprise any of us from New York, where he helped pull off the same remarkable feat in the mid-90s while heading up the NYPD. He re-engineered New York's finest, boosting efficiency, police morale, and most importantly, reducing crime by the largest margins in the city's history. While at the NYPD, Chief Bratton helped lead the development of CompStat, the acclaimed command accountability system that uses computer mapping technology and timely crime analysis to target emerging crime patterns and coordinate rapid and very effective police response. The concrete results of this public service include thousands upon thousands of people who might have lost their lives or livelihood if not for his efforts. A U.S. Army Vietnam veteran, Chief Bratton began his policing career in 1970 as a police officer with the Boston Police Department, rising to superintendent of police, which was the department's highest sworn rank. In the 1980s, Chief Bratton headed 2 other police agencies, the Massachusetts Bay Authority, I believe it's called, Bay Transportation Authority, and the Massachusetts Metropolitan District Commission of Police, before coming to New York in the 90s. He's a frequent lecturer and commentator who I'm very proud to say has written for City Journal in the past. And among his many honors and awards, Chief Bratton holds the Schroeder Brothers Medal, the Boston Police Department's highest award for valor. And in 2007, he was honored by Governing Magazine as one of their public officials of the year. And to get a sense of just how successful he's been here in LA, you might check out the piece in the forthcoming issue of Playboy that was aforementioned by a frequent LAPD critic, Joe Dominic. The piece is called Saving Los Angeles. Anyway, without further ado, we're very honored to have Chief William Bratton give our luncheon talk. Thank you.
I feel it necessary to clarify the Playboy aspect of this. Joe Dominic, who, as many of you from Los Angeles know, has been a long-term critic of the department and its practices, particularly in the 70s and 80s, wrote a book, a seminal book about the department, which is Protected to Serve. Indeed, it was one of the books I really delved into prior to coming into this position. Approached me a few months ago that he wanted to do a profile piece on me and reflecting on some of the changes he thought were occurring and were a direct result of my time as leader of the department. So I agreed to that, and then about a month later he came back, and the only taker was Playboy. And so we asked if we could go forward, and I said sure. We've had presidents and everybody else, and not to take your clothes off, so that worked out okay for me. In any event, there was a profile this month that I was very pleased with, and not an edited version of it without all the other accoutrements that Playboy normally has. That I actually felt a little embarrassed on Sunday. I went to my local newspaper stand to buy one, and the attendant that's known me for 5 years kind of looked at me, and I said, no, see, it's about me. So, as we know, you always pick up Playboy for the columns and the cartoons anyway. In any event, I've been asked to give about 15 minutes of remarks. Those of you who know me, I can do that without taking a breath, so I ask that you bear with me during those 15 minutes of remarks, which will be extemporaneous. I had hoped to have been here this morning to have my remarks come directly from all the discussions this morning, but we were tied up in federal court yesterday and this morning testifying on a lawsuit against the department and the mindless, mind-numbing word games you play in court over those 6 or 7 hours. I'm still kind of numb from the word games that we play in court. In any event, let me talk about this issue, but about it in a larger context. And that larger context is police in our society, the great democratic, constitutionally created society that we're privileged to live in this country. And I reference that because in that society, we the police are the principal entity, the most visible entity, and I would argue one of the most effective entities created by government for the purposes of controlling behavior that is in fact guaranteed by our Constitution, but we, in exchange for the freedom that it promises, agree to our laws, to our rules, regulations, ordinances, to modify our behavior to a common norm. And throughout my now 37 years in the police profession, I have come to increasingly embrace the single idea that I have sought to impart through all my career, that cops count, that police matter, that in our society, that without us, it would be anarchy, and we would not have any freedoms whatsoever. We cannot do it alone, and the discussion this morning, I think, reinforced what we can do, and a lot of what we are not able to do. Nevertheless, we are never at a point in time where we should not try. Because the obligation is, in terms of when we are facing a problem and issues such as the issues that we find in Skid Row, it is incumbent upon us, to the best of our ability, to try to do at least something. And so, in the 37 years of my time in policing, I've watched a number of revolutions occur. And I've watched as my profession has matured from a time in the late 60s when we were anything but a profession. When there were very few people at the head of any organization in this country who had college educations, who had not risen through the ranks of policing, and who had literally had their experiences totally shaped by their internal experiences with very little exposure to outside thinking. Starting in the 70s, George Kelly has written about this more eloquently than anybody I know in terms of the history of policing. We evolved in the sense of responding to societal changes and societal dictates from our legislative leaders and our communities. The professional model of policing that developed was no more emulated than here in LA. LA became the poster boy of that model of policing, the idea to move toward professionalism. Professionalism at that time really meant rapid response to calls for service, random patrol, and random patrol that had some degree of direction to it, and reactive investigations with old Joe Friday, my hero back in those days. We'd arrest him today for some of what he did back then, but back in the 60s and 70s, he was it. In any event, that model still remains an essential element of policing, but it failed miserably in the 1980s saw, as a result of that inefficiency of police, the ineffectiveness of that model by itself, and the idea that police, particularly in this city, is saying, just give us enough resources, leave us alone, and we'll take care of it. Well, unfortunately, the way some organizations have alleged, and in some instances proven, that in taking care of it, we crossed the line. And in crossing that line, we continue to damage relationships. And in crossing the line, we open up the way for some of the lawlessness that occurred and some of our ineffectiveness in dealing with it. Unfortunately, moving into the 1990s and the revolution of policing, the next wave, the next revolution, if you will, community policing, I think with that we really found the model, the successful model, because it emphasized partnership. And in some of your discussions this morning, I think it was quite clear that while the police working with our partners in the criminal justice community, the city attorney, probation, parole, district attorney, other entities, certainly business interests, community interests, business improvement districts, that partnership could in fact bring about some resolution, not necessarily a solution, but some resolution and evolution to a solution of problems. And that by, one, willingness to face the problems, that we might actually get to the third component of community policing, which is prevention. The idea that if police are used appropriately, we have three obligations: to police constitutionally, to police compassionately. By policing compassionately, recognizing that we're always dealing with human beings, no matter what their condition, no matter what their behavior. And that thirdly, to do it consistently. The idea being that so much of the failures of the 70s and 80s was that we would get in and we would get out. Whether it was a 911 call where we were being measured by how fast we get in and got ready for the next call, or by our response to neighborhood problems. We might get in there, make a few arrests, wash our hands of it, and move along. We've learned from that. I've certainly learned from it in many experiences I've had, and very specifically from exposure to George over many years and the many experiences that we've shared, in particular going into the New York City subway environment, in which we were dealing with a very similar set of issues to what we were trying to deal with in the Skid Row area of this city. Similar issues: a homeless population made up of the same, it's ironic, the same almost percentages. 85% will be emotionally, alcohol, or drug impaired. And that population also attracted to it many others who were seeking to take advantage of that impaired state, the commission of crime and abuse, and that in the subways of New York, similar to what had occurred here in Skid Row, it was a problem that was not being addressed adequately, and the police were total failures in the way they were addressing it. But how it was addressed successfully there, and I believe is beginning to be and will continue to be addressed successfully here, is that embodiment of that community policing philosophy, that it requires partnership. Partnership to, in the I sometimes use medical comparisons that I liken what we're dealing with in policing to a doctor dealing with a cancer. There's various forms of cancer. There's the melanoma in the skin, which is an indication there might be something more serious underneath. And so basically what we want to try to do is get it while it's small before it becomes full-blown. But so often when it becomes full-blown, the treatment is oftentimes so severe that it is not without risk. Effectively with chemotherapy and radiation, we're injecting poison into the body that, if not carefully modulated, can in fact ultimately kill or destroy healthy cells. Similarly, with us dealing with the cancer of the issues of crime, disorder, all the issues that we find in Skid Row and subways in New York, or that we find in other neighborhoods that might not be generated so much by issues related to homeless population, but other elements, whether it's the gangs or many other things that we focus our attention on. But the idea is that sometimes the condition has gotten so bad that it requires a medicine that we have to continually balance to ensure that we're not effectively poisoning the patient. And in my world, the policing world, that balance is to ensure that whatever our efforts are, that they are constitutional. That whatever our efforts are, they are compassionate, the best of our ability. And thirdly, that they are consistent. That we're not doing it differently. We may be doing it differently in terms of intensity in an area, because the problem is so intense, but that throughout the city, throughout law enforcement hopefully, that is the driving element. So as we have begun to go at the problem, and I think for the first time successfully, and I do believe we are going at it from a law enforcement perspective successfully, we are, in fact, identifying other issues. And we discussed some of those this morning. And I think based on some of the conversations I've had here, and no surprise, that there is a recognition that there's only so much that the police can do. We can do a lot. We count. And so often, and I believe this is the case in cities in decay, areas of city in decay, that we are the most critical element, that we are the catalyst, we are the flashpoint. And I have really come to believe that even over history, we have been even though we've been the flashpoint for so many negative incidents, whether it's the two sets of riots here in Los Angeles or elsewhere, we, if properly led, properly focused, properly partnered up, can in fact be just the opposite flashpoint, the flashpoint of the cutting edge in success. And I really do believe in our combined efforts to deal with the issues in Skid Row, that the actions of the police have been a significant flashpoint to eventually get us to what I hope will be a tipping point. I think we have arrived at a tipping point as it relates to levels of crime and disorder, in the sense that it is now seen as getting better, versus as recently as 2 years ago, it seems it's just getting worse and worse than is possible. However, we are at a point in time, as you would get with any tipping point, where the medicine needs to be modified. And dealing with a cancer patient, you don't just keep pumping radiation and chemotherapy into that person, because you'll eventually either kill them or it will not have the desired effect. Similarly with our policing efforts, similar to the experience in New York City in the subways and then ultimately in the streets, I still think there is more room for tipping in terms of our efforts, and we are committed to keeping our police resources in that area. We are committed to working in increasingly creative partnerships with our law enforcement criminal justice system. But my perspective on Skid Row at this juncture is what is missing after all of our efforts over the past couple of years are new forms of medicine that are going to allow us to effectively begin to use the police in other ways, in other capacities. And one of the things we've been able to accomplish is that this is what a doctor seeks to do. What is the extent of the problem? What is the extent of the medicine I need to apply to that issue? And so to that end, when we began, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we had a population on the streets, based on our counts, that was 1,750, 1,800. We hit population counts relative to the homeless in the tens of thousands. But as we know, they're not all in Skid Row. They're not all within that 50-block area. And the issue of concern in Skid Row is, in fact, for the police, those on the street who are either engaging in behavior that is not appropriate, authorized, or illegal, and those who may be engaging in behavior against them that is criminal, illegal, or inappropriate. We also have a multiplicity of clients in that area. Because the obligation is not just to serve the one and neglect the other. The other clients we have, in many respects, as many of you in this room, whether it's the bids, whether it's the business owners, whether it's the various entities that are seeking to help the homeless, that we have to be, as police, in some respects, all things to all people, all at the same time. And it's a very difficult balancing act. I'm always reminded of the old Last Act of the Ed Sullivan shows, where that juggler's out there trying to keep all those plates going in the air at the same time, hoping that one doesn't fall and break. Because if one does fall and break, then basically the impression changes. So in our instance, we have attempted to be responsive to, in terms of intake, from all the various clients that we serve, to try to find that balance within those three areas of consistency, compassion, and constitutionality, that we don't effectively kill the patient or the patients, individuals, whether it's business owners or those in the streets. But in our efforts, we've been able to reduce that population on the street. The question is, where have some of them gone? Some have clearly gone to jail, quite frankly. There's a lot of those who were on those streets were the predators. They were down there to prey on the others. They made a lot of arrests of them, and they're gone. Others might not have been down there as predators, but their continued use and abuse of drugs and other actions basically caused their revocation of parole probation. So some of those have in fact been returned into the criminal justice system. Many others, based on the analysis by my personnel, were those that were kind of the hangers-on. But it was a place you could get drugs, you could go down and party, you could go down and a life that most of us in this room would want to be engaged in, but there are many that would want to be in that environment where anything was allowed to go on. A lot of those people have in fact left because they're having controls put in place. We really don't know for certain in terms of those 1,000 who were not there where specifically they all went. A lot of it's anecdotal, a lot of it's conjecture. But we do know they're gone. Because month after month we're down about that hardcore 750. Good news is the additional medicines that I talked about can now be applied. So for example, Project 50, try to take those 50 who are the most significant service leaders, go to the hospital the most often, arrested by us the most often, and just consume millions upon millions of dollars of services, that to try and get them into a new form of housing environment. There's many are resistant to some of the existing forms, whether it's SROs or the shelters that are down there, the missions, etc. The new environment, the new model, if you will, is intended to serve as an inducement to get many of these people off the street, model somewhat after some of the New York experiences and experiments and some of the stuff unfamiliar. So we are at a point in time where, like a doctor, we have now, I think, identified what is the source of all those melanomas, that core problem in that 50-block area. Now the challenge is for the rest of society to step up and partner up with the police, some of the other entities that have been down, the shelter providers, the bids, the other clients. And I think the one thing that is still missing, from a person's perspective, in terms of those partnerships, is in fact the real ability to deliver that housing issue. We talk about the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been allocated for it. We talk about all the grandiose plans and schemes. But with the exception of that Project 50, a lot of it's not come to fruition. The shelter for the homeless families out in the valley finally began to happen after incredible political hurdles had to be overcome. But Skid Row can, in fact, be a place where all the clients that we deal with can, in fact, inhabit it. But to get it to a point where everybody is comfortable with everybody else, the issue from my perspective is going to be we need to basically provide the various forms of housing, job training, various treatments. And unfortunately, at this particular point in time, that has not happened. And as I look at the budget issues that we've been getting briefed on in the city, and you're all aware of from the state and county level, there is a very dark cloud on the horizon, a gathering storm, if you will, that just as we basically got the crop planted and it's starting to flourish, all of a sudden we see this storm coming in that might have the potential, if we're not careful, to destroy so much of what we're doing. My commitment to this community, and you're all part of this community, is that the police resources will stay, and as we grow, will be expanded to allow us to do things other than we've been doing. But the issue that I will continuously speak about will be the need for the rest of the team to step in. That in some respects, we're the surgeon in the trauma room. We've saved the life. We've got that patient that was dying. We've resuscitated it. We're going to live. Now we've got to get it into intensive care. And that's a different set of doctors. It's a different set of physicians, a different set of skills. And experience that George and I have had, New York experience, I think that city got it right. Because that city made up its mind in the early 90s that it was going to do what it would take to address all of its different patients throughout the city. The Times Square problem was a different problem than some of what we see down the Bowery. It's different than what we saw over in the areas of Brooklyn and the Bronx. But it had a commitment. And it put the resources in. And the New York miracle, as it's been described, it's still not utopia. It's certainly a hell of a lot better than it was in the late 80s when George and I first got there, and certainly in the subway system. And in the subway system, let me just close with a comment about that, because it's still, I think, for both George and I, a singular experience that we feel very proud about, because the success there which continues to this day. Let me just give you some numbers to reinforce it. There was an estimated population based on body counts of about 5,000 homeless in the subways of New York at any given time. Platforms and cardboard boxes, on just about every subway car it would seem, and buried deep in the bowels, in those tunnels, 500, who were the worst of the worst, who had totally removed themselves from society, those who were so far gone that they could no longer exist up on the platform or up in the streets. That population each year was suffering, I think in 1990, when we first began, I think the body count was 132 deaths, not murders, deaths, by trains, freezing to death, electrocution on third rails. That 132 out of a population of 5,000, it's a huge loss of people. Within a couple of years, that number was down under 2 dozen. The population in the subway, living in the subway, was down by huge numbers. Many of them went into appropriate shelters. Some went into the streets of New York. But what they understood was that in the subway environment, if you were going to be there, you had to conform to the norms of behavior that were expected in that environment. And that if you did not, the behavior would be corrected. 3.5 million riders, with lots of ridership estimated at about 100,000 a month in New York City in 1990. Today, that same system has 6 million riders. In 1990, we were experiencing about 60 Part 1 crimes a day throughout the whole system with that 3.5 million ridership. Today, some days in the subways of New York, with 6 to 6.5 million riders, there are no reported crimes. And if you ride that system, you're not going to see cardboard boxes. You still see some remnants of it. But effectively, what Malcolm Gladwell wrote about in his tipping point article in the New Yorker, which became the basis of his best-selling book, was that we had been able to tip it. Like dealing with a disease, the disease will multiply rapidly. You have the ability, if you find the right prescription, to just as rapidly tip it the other way and keep it tipped. New York City, we had 3,600 when George and I were there in the subways. Today, the staffing complement there is about 1,600. Why? There's not as much for them to do. There's not as much need for them to do because the behavior changed. The fare evasion has changed. People can evade the fare. We put all types of systems in. We did it in New York, and I know the old slogan, if you can do it in New York, you can do it anywhere. I would argue that the Skid Row issue is even more significant than what we faced in the subways of New York, and that we can, in fact, not only with comfort take the slogan away from New York and apply it here. Because if you can make it happen in the Skid Row of LA, you can make it happen anywhere. And I think there is still room for optimism for that. And I think we also have to be remarkably wide-eyed and understanding of the complexities and the challenges facing us. My commitment as Chief of Police is to keep this department focused on it, fulfilling our responsibility, and in some respects exceeding our area of responsibility, to be as involved as we can with all the other elements involved. So I'm not just the trauma room physician and then passes off the patient into the ICU. My intention is to follow into the ICU and stay involved with that other team that's attempting to now basically keep that patient alive. So that, I think you've firsthand seen that that commitment is just not reflected on me, but many men and women who sit in this room wearing that blue uniform and the badge that are so far up, that I think we are fulfilling that obligation of our constitutional democracy to the best of our ability ensure the safety and tranquility of all, and to do it compassionately, consistently, and constitutionally. My remarks, and I'll look for questions.
Test, test.
George, when was the last time you saw a bowler like that? Our late great friend Jack Maple used to wear one just like it. Smartest guy that ever lived on the issue of crime, besides George Kelly.
Wow. Thank you. All due respect, I'm a Skid Row resident, and I do agree that a lot of things that the department is doing are positive. But earlier you mentioned, you made a reference to the social service providers as well as other organizations in the Skid Row community themselves, making the department feel like they're all things to all people. I don't know if you were using that as a trendy quote or if you really had a definition in terms of all things. I just wish you could clarify that.
All things in the sense of those three issues of our obligation to operate constitutionally with all of you. And let's face it, some of you in this room would, if you give your druthers, would basically put the Constitution aside for a while to let us go in and do our business. Can't do it. And so that's that balancing act. The compassion, I have to have compassion in the sense of understanding a Stella or Carol and the interests of the business community they represent, that clientele. I have to have the capacity to understand the needs of the missions, capacity of the residents down in that area, capacity of those that are on the streets. So I have to have a shared compassion for all of their respective issues. And lastly, the consistency, the idea that we can't be doing it one way here, we're not doing it we're not doing it the same way someplace else. So that's in terms of, it's not just a phrase, it's the heart and soul of what we do. And I'd also point out, and this is something I like to drive home, we do it transparently. That in the subways of New York, with the exception of when we were in the subways, we were on platforms, we were on trains, in a very transparent environment. And I think one of the reasons why New York got its arms around this problem so successfully was that every day there was 3.5 million people, and now 6.5 million people. The shared experience in New York was the subway. So the shared experience of the homeless situation, the plight of the homeless, the behaviors of many of the homeless, was felt by, every day, half of the population. Our issue in Skid Row, while we have homeless throughout the city, and you cannot drive around the city anywhere without seeing the shopping carts, etc., but the intensity of Skid Row is experienced only by a few. Of the 3.5 million to 4 million people who live in this city, it's experienced by probably 50, 60,000 people routinely, if even that many. Everybody else basically drives by on the freeway. They're not riding through the streets. I can still remember myself the first time I came here. I just couldn't believe it. I thought I'd seen everything in New York. And so that, at the same time, the streets are transparent. Everything we're doing down here is on the streets. Because the population that we're trying to assist, the one that is the most visible in terms of the impact on what they're doing to themselves or what is being done to them in terms of lack of care that might be provided, there is a transparency to what we're trying to do. And the term transparent, the first time I ever heard it was, I really do believe Jack Maple used it in 94, 95 at a meeting in the sense of what we were trying to accomplish. And it's now become one of the buzzwords of policing. What we're trying to do, community policing is about transparency, about opening ourselves up to those partnerships and to that input. So it's something else we need to keep in mind, that there's nothing to hide in terms of what we're trying to do. We're very open about it, very open about behaviors that we're engaging in and the behaviors that we expect of the people that we're engaging with.
Good afternoon, Chief Bratton. My question is, did the New York State law requiring the provision of emergency shelter beds aid your efforts in getting people out of the subways or off the street? And would you recommend similar legislation in California or Los Angeles?
There were several things that assisted us in the subway experience. The subway experience is different somewhat from the street experience. But one of them was, in fact, the law requiring that basically there'd be an effort made to accommodate the population. And so the one thing that New York had going for it, even in the early 90s, was a shelter system that was not concentrated in just one area of the city. Every borough of the city had shelters, huge, fortress-like institutions, not too dissimilar to the mental institutions that we tried to get rid of in the 70s and 80s. What we eliminated in the 70s, we effectively created from time in New York, recreated as the shelters for the homeless, because they had much of the same feel, as the institutions which many of them had actually come out of, ironically. We did not have a homeless problem. Indeed, that term homeless didn't really occur until, as George has written eloquently about, we had deinstitutionalization in the 70s, compounded by decriminalization, a lot of the laws that we used to control some of that behavior, drunk laws, etc. And then thirdly, depolicing. So few police on the streets. New York City went down to 21,000 police officers in the 1970s, at the height of the city disassembly. So their laws and the obligation to fund, in fact, did help. And then we also had the benefit of the subway system, the ability to basically move people out of the system. That's what we did. We moved them onto buses to transport them to the shelters. It was not just a matter of ejection, displacement. It was, with compassion, the idea, particularly on winter nights, you're not going to freeze to death in one of those tunnels in the subway. We're going to get you on a bus and get you to a shelter. We had laws that allowed us to effectively, temporarily, take custody of an individual who was at risk to themselves because of their condition. And so we had some assistance there. So New York was aided by laws that required high degrees of spending, and but it took them many years to get it right. There's those shelters that eventually became SROs, and then eventually became like Project 50, different types of housing with different types of needs. I'll let some of it went on in the 90s, but you can still read stories today about New York City in terms of shelter for families, homeless families. It's still not an issue-free issue, but it's tipped from what it was in the positive.
My name is Don Garzine. I did a long dissertation. I actually have a question. You know, living down there and understanding the NIMBY issue that everybody has with, especially the Safer Cities initiative, everybody afraid that everybody would be displaced. I mean, is it an unwarranted fear on behalf, I know maybe you can't speak clean, it's probably it has to do with the ACLU and other people. Is there some sort of unwarranted fear, NIMBY fear, that somehow Skid Row, emissions, and everybody is going to be completely rolled over and gentrified out of downtown? And myself, I don't even perceive, you know, that happening anywhere in my lifetime.
I think there's a lot of different perspectives about what the ultimate outcome might be down there as the economic forces create change in that neighborhood, as it creates change all over the city. We really, there's a similar debate going on now over Universal City. There's some similar debates going on now over the Staples Center as the nature of an area is changing. It's part of life. Nothing ever stays the same forever. In the case of Skid Row, because there's so much attention focused on the negative aspects of what goes on down there, there's a combined set of issues. Fear of others who are living in neighborhoods that don't have that problem that's going to come to them. And two, a fear on the part, I think, of some of those who choose to live in that area that, in fact, they're going to be pushed out as the economic conditions change. That's what I'm saying. It's just the answers to some of these issues are beyond my scope of responsibility, but it's not beyond my scope of awareness, because being aware of that is how I serve all the different clients, understanding that each client might have a very different perspective about what it is we should do or should not do, or how we should prioritize. And the old expression, policeman's lot, is not a happy one, and it's certainly a very confusing one, but in the sense of trying to deal with all these different constituencies or clients.
Although we may have a lot of different agreements of perspectives here, I think we're all here because we understand that this isn't about numbers, but it's about people's lives. What do you see as you talked about different levels of medicine. What do you see as the next levels for the next 2 or 3 years of maybe coming up with some interim solutions where the permanent supportive housing has not been done? There's not a consensus for the other neighborhoods to partner. There's not the commitment from the federal government and county. But what can we do ourselves as a community downtown to create a safe place for homeless people, but also an environment for people like Don that live here, for the people who have businesses, for the people who really want to be progressive and care, but are stuck in this place where long-term is sort of a dream, and most of our partners who we see in the community who are saying they're taking care of the homelessness, and not the missions, but the other people, seem not to be those partners who are helping. So where can we reach that consensus? Is it taking over warehouses and helping? Is it parking lots? Is it just throwing up our hands in frustration?
I wish I had the answer, and I do not. I am part of it. Part of it is us, an essential part, us being the police, and that we will continue to stay, probably expand actually as the department grows in size, because there's going to be growing need for police services downtown, even as some of the needs for services of the homeless population, which is diminishing in number down there, so the amount of time we have to spend on it will change. You'll also have, as the demands grow with the new population, 24-hour-a-day needs of police down there, where at night I can oftentimes, like down at the Staples area, after the first game of the night's over 10 o'clock, I could reduce the size of my police force down there. We're going to have to start planning for 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, large numbers of police down there. Similarly, as the growth continues down in the Skid Row area, the police headquarters were up to those apartment towers. Policing that I could get by with relatively few is going to have to expand. So you'll continue to stay involved to be part of that series of descriptions. But I don't have a resolution to some of the other things we identified. I have a shared incredible frustration with, as all of you know, my staying for government here in California, in the city. It is an incredible abyss of things not happening. And it's extraordinarily frustrating. I've never seen any place quite like it. The designation of Hollywood as Looney Tunes is very appropriate. And basically in terms of it can apply to the whole city. And it is frustrating because we are very secularized, very parochialized in a way that I came from a very parochial city, Boston, and we went through horrific times with desegregation of schools, desegregation of housing, but I haven't quite seen anything like this place. So I wish I had to be able to stand up here and just, just matter 1, 2, 3, 4, because I'm a problem solver. We're part of it, but we're not all of it. And again, that's where it's going to keep needed for all of us to stay engaged, stay active, doing things like this to keep this. And my compliments to the Manhattan Institute in the sense that this is an issue they focused on in New York, and helped shape some very significant change there. Their articles and some of their pieces, Heather and others, whether you agree or disagree with some of the premises, it keeps the issue on the front page. It's very similar to what I'm trying to do with policing in this presidential race. The idea right now, none of the candidates has focused on policing, issue of crime. They're focused on terrorism. We don't quite see the nexus and understand the nexus between traditional crime and terrorism. But the good news about the economic downturn, and based on listening to the radio this morning, we're in a nosedive, basically that's continuing today in very significant proportions. The economy actually becoming the number one issue in the presidential race gets us back in the game. Because while I argue vehemently that the economy causes crime, people cause crime. They break the law. Sometimes their motivation might be, or the influence might be, lack of jobs, etc. So as the economy worsens, we will undoubtedly see in some areas of the country increases in crime. So the candidate's going to have to focus on that issue. And so for me, that's good news because that gets crime, the importance of police, how we police, back onto the front burner. And that's what articles such as Heather or a continuing series of pieces we had Institute or things that George writes about or he and I co-author. It's important because what compels me is the idea that what you inspect, you can expect. When we, up until 2006, were not engaged as a police department in Skid Row, total anarchy. When we got engaged, great leadership, and even in the room here today, Andy Smith, Jody Wakefield, and others, certainly some extraordinary cops who are all volunteers, by the way. And that's something that needs to be understood. Skid Row, all volunteers. Some might be down there for a while that don't want to be there, but they get the opportunity to leave. And so that also is something that helps us down here. We're very, to support the idea of compassion, support the idea of consistency. And I do have a police department, some might argue that we are not, but we are a constitutional police force. We're a great police force with high integrity, high ethics, and that allows us to be as effective as we are with as few resources as we have. But the idea is that we're in there to stay. And I'm hoping that as this presidential race progresses, there'll be a lot more attention focused on some of these issues. Because to get that economy revved up, we have to put some resources into it. Have we exhausted you all? Good, you feel like I do. I have no voice left. Thank you.
I want to thank you all again for coming for this morning of ideas and exchanging viewpoints. And I want to thank Chief Bratton again for lending us time this afternoon. So thank you very much, and thanks on behalf of both the Manhattan Institute and the Milken Institute. Okay, if I could have everybody's attention. I'd like to get our luncheon talk underway here. And our luncheon speaker, closing out what I hope has been an informative morning for all of us, really needs no introduction, certainly not to any of you, but I'll give you one anyway. William Bratton was appointed chief of the Los Angeles Police Department in October of 2002. This past October, he became, I believe, the first chief to be reappointed to a second 5-year term in office in the city's history. Now, Chief Bratton oversees the third largest police department in the United States, managing 9,600 sworn officers, 3,000 civilian employees, and an annual budget that's, I believe, a little over $1 billion. His record as chief has been one of constant innovation, improving both crime fighting and accountability. After Chief Bratton's 4 years in office, crime in Los Angeles, including on Skid Row, has plummeted, in fact, to historically low levels, with serious crimes down citywide over 30% before coming to New York in the 90s. He's a frequent lecturer and commentator who I'm very proud to say has written for City Journal in the past. And among his many honors and awards, Chief Bratton holds the Schroeder Brothers Medal, the Boston Police Department's highest award for valor. And in 2007, he was honored by Governing Magazine as one of their public officials of the year. And to get a sense of just how successful he's been here in LA, you might check out the piece in the forthcoming issue of Playboy that was aforementioned. By a frequent LAPD critic, Joe Dominic. The piece is called Saving Los Angeles. Anyway, without further ado, we're very honored to have Chief William Bratton give our luncheon talk. Thank you.
I feel it necessary to clarify the Playboy aspect of this. Joe Dominic, who, as many of you from Los Angeles know, has been a long-term critic of the department and its practices, particularly in the 70s and 80s, wrote a seminal book about the department, which is Protected to Serve. Indeed, it was one of the books I really delved into prior to coming into this position. Approached me a few months ago that he wanted to do a profile piece on me and reflecting on some of the changes he thought were occurring and were a direct result of my time as leader of the department. So I agreed to that, and then about a month later he came back, and the only taker was Playboy. And so we asked if we could go forward, and I said sure. We've had presidents and everybody else, and you don't have to take your clothes off, so that worked out okay for me. In any event, there was a profile this month that I was very pleased with, and not an edited version of it without all the other accoutrements that Playboy normally has. That actually felt a little embarrassed on Sunday. I went to my local newspaper stand to buy one, and the attendant that's known me for 5 years kind of looked at me, and I said, no, see, it's about me. So, as we know, you always pick up Playboy for the columns and the cartoons anyway. In any event, I've been asked to give about 15 minutes of remarks. Those who know me, I can do that without taking a breath, so I ask that you bear with me during those 15 minutes of remarks, which will be extemporaneous. I had hoped to have been here this morning to have my remarks come directly from all the discussions this morning, but we were tied up in federal court yesterday and this morning testifying on a lawsuit against the department and the mindless, mind-numbing word games you play in court over those 6 or 7 hours. I'm still kind of numb from the word games that we play in court. In any event, let me talk about this issue, but about it in a larger context. And that larger context is police in our society, the great democratic, constitutionally created society that we're privileged to live in this country. And I reference that because in that society, we the police are the principal entity, the most visible entity, and I would argue one of the most effective entities created by government for the purposes of controlling behavior that is in fact guaranteed by our Constitution, but we, in exchange for the freedom that it promises, agree to our laws, to our rules, regulations, ordinances, to modify our behavior to a common norm. And throughout my now 37 years in the police profession, I have come to increasingly embrace the single idea that I have sought to impart through all my career, that cops count, that police matter, that in our society, that without us, it would be anarchy, and we would not have any freedoms whatsoever. We cannot do it alone, and the discussion this morning, I think, reinforced what we can do, but a lot of what we are not able to do. Nevertheless, we are never at a point in time where we should not try. Because the obligation is in terms of when we are facing a problem and issue such as the issue
% and homicides down 40%. And he's done this while expanding the LAPD's counterterrorism efforts in innovative ways that other departments across the country are learning from and emulating. Now, none of what has happened in LA would surprise any of us from New York, where he helped pull off the same remarkable feat in the mid-90s while heading up the NYPD. He re-engineered New York's finest, boosting efficiency, police morale, and most importantly, reducing crime by the largest margins in the city's history. While at the NYPD, Chief Bratton helped lead the development of CompStat, the acclaimed command accountability system that uses computer mapping technology and timely crime analysis to target emerging crime patterns and coordinate rapid and very effective police response. The concrete results of this public service include thousands upon thousands of people who might have lost their lives or livelihood if not for his efforts. A U.S. Army Vietnam veteran, Chief Bratton began his policing career in 1970 as a police officer with the Boston Police Department, rising to Superintendent of Police, which was the department's highest sworn rank. In the 1980s, Chief Bratton headed 2 other police agencies, the Massachusetts Bay Authority, I believe it's called, Bay Transportation Authority, and the Massachusetts Metropolitan District Commission Police.